Session 3 will focus on countering ISIS, the Marawi aftermath. This session will be moderated by Associate Professor Kumar Ramakrishna, Head of Policy Studies and Coordinator for National Security Studies Program at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies, Nanyang Technological University, Singapore. Associate Professor Kumar, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. Morning, everyone, esteemed guests and colleagues. We are now in panel 3, where we are going to look at issue of terrorism. We'll focus on Marawi. Brief background, as we know, between May and October 2017 last year, a lot of global attention was placed on the city of Marawi in Lanao del Sur province in Mindanao, southern Philippines. As we know, ISIS-backed militants fought a grueling urban battle with the Philippine armed forces. Eventually, the ISIS militants, as we know, were defeated. But as we know, it's not over yet. In particular, two key questions remain. Number one, what are the implications of the Marawi incident for the Philippines? And secondly, and of course, equally important, what are the implications of the Marawi episode for the wider region? So to help us address these two questions, we have two very accomplished, distinguished colleagues with us this morning. First up, we will have Ms. Mina Rasool Bernardo, President of the Philippine Council for Islam and Democracy, who will share with us her assessment of the impact of the Marawi incident on the Philippines in the south and the whole country. And after that, Ms. Sydney Jones, Director of the Institute of Policy Analysis of Conflict in Jakarta, will address the issue of the wider regional implications. Each speaker will have about 15 to 20 minutes max, and after that, we'll have some time for Q&A. So with that, pass the time to Amina.
Thank you, Kumar. Why are we so interested in Marawi, apart from the fact that it has hogged headlines for globally? Well, you're here to look at economic development, progress in the region as affected by global factors. And Marawi brings home to us very, very dramatically the fact that the geopolitical risks tied to violent extremism emanating from the Middle East and North Africa is here. And we need to do something about it if we are going to be able to pursue development, not only for our countries, but for the region as well. So let's look at Marawi. This is Marawi then, before the crisis, and this is Marawi now. Looks more like Mosul than it does a Philippine rural city. Let's take a look at Marawi before the siege and Muslim Mindanao in general. Muslim Mindanao used to be the majority in the island of Mindanao. In 1918, we dominated the region together with the indigenous peoples. Christian population at the time was about 20%. Today, we are now just 28% of Mindanao. The indigenous peoples who are called Lumads, about 12.3%, and the Christian population is 60%. So you can understand already, as part of the feelings of the minority groups in Mindanao about what they lost. They who used to be the kingpins of Mindanao are now minority, and it's been less than 100 years. Now let's take a look at something even more dramatic to explain the feelings of the communities. Let's take a look at access to piped water. In 1970, if you look at Muslim Mindanao, particularly Lanao del Norte, Sulu, Lanao Sur, we weren't bottom of the heap when you look at progress and development. And here the indicator is access to piped water. In 1970, my home, Sulu, for instance, was ranked number 37 in the whole country in terms of access of households to piped water. The home of former President Gloria Macapagal Arroyo, Pampanga, was ranked 39. So we weren't that far off. By the year 1990, Sulu was already at the bottom. And of course, Pampanga has zoomed to the top. Today, the Muslim provinces, Lanao Sur and Marawi included, are down there in the bottom, basket cases, least access to piped water and other services. Now let's take a look at electricity, access to electricity. Again, the Muslim provinces weren't doing so badly in 1970. Sulu, my home, we were ranked 38, and Ilocos Sur, where the Marcoses come from, was ranked 50. So we weren't doing so badly. But by 1990, Sulu was 73, and Ilocos Sur was number 13, bottom of the heap. And that trend has continued to this date. This is what happened to Muslim Mindanao. Martial law in the 70s, bombing of the communities, hamleting operations, destruction of infrastructure, which led to capital flight and which led to brain drain. So the Muslim provinces that used to be relatively okay are now basket cases. And from the mid-70s to today, nothing has changed. So think mindset, how the communities, the Muslim communities in Mindanao are feeling about developments. ARM today, Muslim Mindanao, ARM is the autonomous region of Muslim Mindanao. It's the most marginalized, the most conflict-affected, poorest, least served region. And today, after Marawi, the peace process is at risk. The peace process with the Moro National Liberation Front included, and the Moro Islamic Liberation Front. Discrimination against Muslims are rising, particularly with what we hear about ISIS and Boko Haram. Violent extremism has gained a foothold, not just because of Marawi, but the precedent siege, Mamasapano and Zamboanga. And the fear of martial law, which has colored the perceptions of many of the communities and their leaders, is rising again. This is what we worry about, and this is what we need to work on collectively. The feeling that they are not part of the community and therefore are wide open to become part of another community, in this case, a global caliphate. Let me take a look at just a few drivers of violent extremism that play up in the Marawi situation. There are many drivers: poverty, lack of education, but I just want to take a look at this. First is the military response to conflicts. Second is discrimination because of misconceptions and false narratives. And the third is the derailment of the peace process. Military responses. This particular slide came from the Armed Forces of the Philippines. When they looked at military response to conflict resolution, to terrorism, they were pretty good when they were analyzing it, because they looked at interlocking factors, which include not just security issues, but governance, minimal economic activities, proliferation of an underground economy, illiteracy, non-implementation of customs, immigration, environmental and maritime laws. And here in our region, maritime laws is very important because we have a very porous borders, the seas that connects Malaysia, Indonesia, Singapore, and the Philippines. Non-delivery of basic services and non-implementation of socioeconomic programs. This is from the military. But what happened in the Marawi crisis? After more than 5 months, Mosul-like environment. And now we're talking about rehabilitation. If Marawi was alone, stand-alone event, perhaps our fears would not be as strong. But unfortunately, Marawi followed the Zamboanga crisis of 2013, where after a week of battling with followers of the Moro National Liberation Front of Miswari, 5 villages in a prosperous Christian-dominated city, Zamboanga City, were burned to the ground. The Christian villages were not touched, but the 5 Muslim villages, the 5 barangays, were. And the villages, the Muslims in those villages have not fully recovered. Some of them are still staying in refugee camps. So Zamboanga crisis. And then there was the Mama Sapano incident. The Mama Sapano incident of 2015, although the effect was not as widespread as Zamboanga and Marawi, led to the derailment of the peace process because it derailed the passage of the Bangsamoro Basic Law. Why is the Bangsamoro Basic Law very important? The BBL is a result of negotiations, first with the Moro National Liberation Front that started in the mid-70s, and finally with the Moro Islamic Liberation Front. It fleshed out the terms of the agreement for true, genuine autonomy. And once this was granted, then the liberation fronts would end the wars of independence and accept to be part of the Philippine nation. That therefore gives us very strong foundation of stability, politically, security, we talk about security and economically. But Mama Sapano derailed that. And after Mama Sapano, the rise of discrimination and anger against Muslims rose. And we had this problem about false narratives and misconceptions. A survey was taken post-Mama Sapano, and they found out that outside of the Muslim provinces, indeed, discrimination had risen, and the peace process was not seen as a viable solution. Now, this is the interesting thing. The Muslims and the residents of Mindanao generally still supported the Bangsamoro Basic Law and the peace process in spite of Mama Sapano. But the residents of the Visayas and Luzon, far away from Mindanao, were the ones who essentially killed the Bangsamoro Basic Law. The lack of knowledge about their own peoples has become a problem for our archipelagic nation. So misconceptions and false narratives. And now this is the situation of the Bangsamoro Basic Law. The bill has been passed to Congress where it has slept a bit. The President has already said that it's important to pass the Bangsamoro Basic Law. It's supposed to be passed by March 18, a couple of months away, but we don't hear of much movements about the Bangsamoro Basic Law. We're hearing more about federalism, charter change. So if they're saying that federalism or changing the system of government is the answer to the granting of autonomy to these groups who have been fighting for independence, we're going to have a problem. So most of the peoples who have been engaged in looking at peace, peaceful resolution of the armed conflicts in the South, are lobbying for the passage of the Bangsamoro Basic Law, even if there is a move to change the system of government to federalism. So, these are some of the reasons that have been given by civil society, religious leaders, when we talk to them about why pass the Bangsamoro Basic Law. They say that it has been cooked already and just needs to be served, meaning to say it has been negotiated. The terms of autonomy have been negotiated over 40 years, first with the MNLF and now with the MILF. So just pass it already, because they're not talking about giving independence to a group. You're just saying we're giving you more autonomy within the system. It will be a strong deterrent to violent extremism post-Marawi. Why is that? Because the leaders of the Maute group, as they're called, have been using as a banner the insincerity of national government vis-a-vis the minority groups because of the non-passage of the Bangsamoro Basic Law. Pass the Bangsamoro Basic Law and you reduce the justification of such acts of heinous aggression. So, given this kind of a situation, why is it important for us to do something about it, and what do we do about it? Again, we require stability for our country to develop and for our region to grow. How do you do it? Obviously, the military solution alone cannot work. There has got to be a collective, a comprehensive program, not just to contain, but to prevent the expansion of extremist thought. And when we're looking at the prevention of violent extremism, let me give particular attention to these three. First, the role of Muslim religious leaders and teachers, the role of women and also of youth, and then the role of education. Religious leaders. We did a survey several years ago looking at trust rating in the Muslim communities, 4,000 respondents. And we realized that the religious leaders were the most trusted. Their total trust rating was close to 90%, and the closest to them was not the governor or the congressman, it was the elected village leader. But in spite of this, not much is being done to bring over the Muslim religious leaders to work with national government or the development community for that matter in terms of development, in terms of peace building, in terms of prevention of violent extremism. And this needs to be done because the Muslim religious leaders are everywhere. National government is not. So it doesn't make sense to make an ally. And what do you do with an ally? You provide them capacity building. In the religious sector discussions that we've had, and a lot of this came from a regional conference that we organized with the Rajanatram School for International Studies that was held in September 22 to 23 on prevention of violent extremism. The religious sector were willing to work with national government and the rest so that we can prevent, contain the expansion of extremist thought. And these are some of their recommendations. If you look at it, they're really asking for capacity building. How do you neutralize the ISIS message when we have no knowledge about how to use Facebook or Twitter? We cannot come up with a communication strategy. The religious leaders are very good interlocutors because they have the substance, they have the weight. They don't have the knowledge on how to communicate. How about women and youth? Again, during the conference that we had last year and in other consultations, women also agree that there is a very strong role for women to play and for the youth to play. Why is that? When you are looking for the first signs of problems in a community or a household, it is normally the woman who will be able to sense if there's something going wrong or not. And I'm not just talking about mothers and their families. I'm talking about the women who teach in the madrasa or who teach in the public schools. So the question again arises, is there anything being done to provide these women the capacity to be able to monitor and do something about possible resurgence of threats? Here are some of their recommendations on what can be done so that they can be more fully participating in programs to prevent violent extremism. The youth as well. And here the youth even pays particular attention to the need for employment and livelihood. They are no longer children, and they need to become active parts of the community, active actors in the community. Take a look at Marawi. Marawi have over 200,000 refugees. A large part of that are young, and they're all jobless. When you look at the ISIS influence groups, the Abu Sayyaf, the MILF, large part of their forces are young. And why are the young people with them? It's not that they don't want to be part of the education. I have done a lot of interviews with child soldiers, and to a boy or girl, they want to be back in school. It's just that there is no opportunity for them. They're orphaned, no one to support them, and they have been welcomed by the Liberation Fronts, or in this case, the Maute Group. What can you do to provide opportunities for the youth sector so that they can become part of the community? Now let's take a look at inclusive growth. Development, economic development and progress cannot be sustained if it's not inclusive, if you miss out on bringing in majority of the stakeholders. But here in ASEAN, particularly in the rural communities and in the case of the Philippines, Muslim Mindanao, you have this huge problem of illiteracy. Let me just show you this. In the autonomous region of Muslim Mindanao, more than 38% of the labor force are illiterate, and these are adults. If you're going to bring in business and development, do you really think that your adult force will be able to take advantage? In Marawi, let's bring in economic development, capital investment. Will the adults of Marawi be able to take advantage? Or do you need to import people from the Christian communities beside Marawi, like Iligan and Cagayan de Oro? So the question that we have raised time and again, why don't we first do something about the adult illiterates? And in the case of Muslim Mindanao, this number, more than 500,000 adults, 18 and above. Now, self-employment, unpaid family workers, generally these are unpaid. You only have a 15% part of the labor force that are salaried. And why is it like this? Largely because they do not have the skills and they are unemployable because they're illiterate. Imagine if you converted this particular sector to literacy. And now let me just give you a brief on the findings and the recommendations during the conference that we co-organized with the RSIS. We had more than 400, about 423 delegates, and we paid close attention to bringing in 6 sectors: the business sector, women, youth, religious leaders, academe, and the political actors. We tried as much as possible to let these sectors come together in breakout sessions so that they can come up with their own analysis and their own recommendations. You can look at all of those recommendations in the Facebook page for this conference, and we are coming out with a book that would detail this. But suffice it to say that in the statement agreed upon by all the participants, there was very strong support for issues like networking, capacity building, more opportunities given to women and youth, and a highlight on religious leaders. A strategy for communication using cyberspace and social media. There was a very strong call, and this I think we need you to help us on, for our governments to come up with comprehensive national action plans for the prevention of violent extremism. And also quite important, for ASEAN to have its own regional action plan for the prevention of violent extremism. If we don't focus on prevention, then ladies and gentlemen, we're going to have more Marawis. Marawi has become something attractive for young people who are disgruntled and disadvantaged because they saw a group led by 2 charismatic young men hold government at bay for more than 5 months. And that is the stuff of legend, which we need to debunk. Thank you.
Thanks, Mina. Next up, we have Sydney Jones.
Okay. Thank you. Dr. Amina's presentation is a great lead-in to what I'd like to reflect on in terms of the impact of Marawi in the region. I think one of the things that's important to ask is, what did the people who commandeered Marawi actually want to accomplish? And I think it's becoming increasingly clear that, first of all, it was a long time in the planning, and secondly, what they were hoping to do was precisely to create a new Mosul, that they wanted to control territory where they would set up an Islamic form of governance, and that this plan emerged from discussions between people with Katiba Nusantara, the Malay-speaking unit of ISIS in Syria, with the Mautes and others in Butig at the time and in Lanao del Sur. So the whole concept of Marawi arose from discussions between members of the Southeast Asian ISIS leadership in Syria with people in the Philippines. And from the beginning, it attracted fighters from Indonesia and Malaysia. We already had Malaysians who were working in Basilan from actually before the caliphate was announced in 2014, especially Dr. Mahmoud, the Malaysian who became such a key strategist and fundraiser. But we also had Indonesians who were going to train in the Philippines from mid-2016 onwards, from before Marawi actually broke out, almost a year before Marawi erupted. So this was already a regional issue long before the 23rd of May. I think one of the impacts of Marawi is that it has set a new bar for extremists from across Southeast Asia of what they can actually aspire to. They can aspire to bringing different groups together. They can aspire to a regional initiative, and they can aspire to actually setting up an area where they can apply Islamic law in full. Now, I think it's important to note that it's the latter that was the attraction, rather than the idea that somehow you were going to clash with the Philippines army for 5 months. I'm not sure that that's what the attraction was, but the pull of the idea of setting up a province of the Islamic State in Marawi was very powerful. I think we have seen the kind of coordination between Syria and the region and among different extremist groups in the region in relation to Marawi be something that is going to continue. We've already seen, just on New Year's Eve, a group of Indonesians getting arrested in Sabah who were planning to go to the Philippines, and the idea that the Philippines is the desirable training ground for extremists in the region, I think is going to continue. It's not new. The Philippines was a training ground in the 1990s and in 2000, but I think it's gotten a new credibility and a new push even after Marawi has been liberated. I think we've got a situation now where the ideology of Salafi jihadism has taken root in the Philippines, and in some cases, I think has replaced the ethno-nationalist idea that autonomy or independence was the best outcome for the Philippines. And I think one major impact of Marawi is that it has exposed some major flaws in regional cooperation, and I'll come back to that. I do not believe, however, that we're in any danger of the Philippines becoming the second front of ISIS. I don't believe that there's going to be some kind of vast tectonic shift that moves the focus of the global jihad into Southeast Asia. That was never going to happen, but I think there are consequences for both the Philippines and the region more broadly that we have to look at. I think when we look at the context, Professor Amina has given us a great background on that. I think there are a couple of other factors. I think we have seen a declining role of the MILF, the group that was negotiating with the government even before Marawi erupted, but particularly as a consequence of Marawi, the failure of the MILF to come to the protection of the people in Marawi and the inability of the MILF to in any way blunt the growth of this extremist ideology means that I think the potential for Islamist extremist groups drawing on a pool of recruits from the MILF is going to continue. And I agree that there were very few efforts, if any, by the Philippine government to understand the process of radicalization that was occurring, because it was occurring not just in the poor marginalized communities, it was also occurring in the educated, well-to-do communities. It's very interesting if you look at the backgrounds of the people who were involved in the Cotabato cell that were involved in the Davao bombing. These were university-educated students of computer science in many cases, and that also included sons of well-to-do members of leading political families in and around the Cotabato region. So it's true that the poor and marginalized Moros were a recruiting pool, and the economic and political marginalization was a very important part of the narrative. But it wasn't just the poor who were attracted by the ISIS ideology. If we look at the areas that composed the pro-ISIS coalition, I think we need to think about what happens to each of these areas in the aftermath of Marawi. We had the group on Basilan, we had the group in Lanao del Sur, that Blue Star, we have the ongoing fighting in central Mindanao, in Maguindanao, and then we had the Yellow Star where the AKP, a very small group, was operative. And I think one of the things we're going to see in the aftermath of Marawi is the breakup of that coalition back into its component parts, but with the possibility that the Islamist jihadist ideology continues to dominate in some of these areas. I think in Marawi we have to face the possibility that a new Maranao-based insurgency that might replace the MILF could arise in the future. But what's also important is that each one of these component parts has its own links to the region. The AKP has its own links to Indonesia. Basilan has its links to Indonesia and Malaysia. Lanao del Sur has its own links to Indonesia and Malaysia. So even if this pro-ISIS coalition disperses and fissures into the parts that created it, I think we're still going to have a regional issue for a long time to come. What happens after Marawi, after liberation? In addition to the breakup of the pro-ISIS coalition, I think that we could see urban attacks, particularly in, I would suggest, Manila, Davao, Zamboanga, and Cotabato, and I think it's one of the components of the pro-ISIS coalition which needs a lot more attention is the group of Muslim converts who joined the ISIS group sometimes within weeks after their conversion from Christianity to Islam. Again, if you look at the Cotabato cell, there were kids who converted to Islam and within 2 weeks were at a training center. And these are children or teenagers who came from Visayas and Luzon in the northern area. And clearly we're going to have critical issues in terms of security as the reconstruction process takes place, and the possibility that resentment over the speed or justice issues involved in the reconstruction could become a fertile source of recruitment. I think it's important to look at this issue of are we going to see foreign fighters coming back from Syria in a way that could basically take the spark that Marawi created and regenerate the pro-ISIS coalition, or a different kind of coalition in the region? First of all, I do think that we need to worry about a handful of Southeast Asians currently in Syria, 2 or 3 of whom could come back to the region and play a leadership role, particularly those who have already been in communication with members of the ISIS coalition and with the Mautes in particular. I don't think we're going to see any major flood of returnees of Southeast Asians from the region. I think we're going to see Mindanao continue to be an attractive place for training and particularly for gun purchases. I think that we're going to see Indonesian foreign fighters who are currently in Syria try to get back to Indonesia rather than try to find a safe haven in Mindanao. A few Malaysians might be a different story because the chances of getting caught in Malaysia on return might be higher. But I think many of the Southeast Asians who are currently stranded in the Middle East or who are in pockets in Syria after the defeats and pushbacks there are likely to be drawn into other theaters in the region, in Sinai, in Libya, in other areas, rather than, at least initially, to come back to the region. And I also think it's worth putting all of this in context. For all of the cooperation among extremist groups that has taken place, we're still not up to the level of coordination and communication that took place under Jama'ah Islamiyah in the early 2000s. And I just put this chart up here to remind us of how long we've had coordination and cooperation among different extremist groups in the region. So even with all of the concern about ISIS now, we're still not at the levels that we had in 1999 and 2000. I think one of the concerns is that Indonesian groups could draw inspiration from Marawi to coordinate and overcome some of the factionalism that has characterized the Indonesian extremist movement in a way that could increase the risk in Indonesia. And we've already seen the 2 major groups in Syria, led by Indonesians, come together out of the exigencies of the defeats of ISIS in Syria. In terms of the 3 major streams of groups, of pro-ISIS groups that we have in Indonesia today, we have this, the yellow stream on the left, the group called JAD, continuing to try to send people to Mindanao, continuing to communicate with Syria, and continuing to get some financial assistance from Syria. And increasingly, we're seeing coordination with Katiba Nusantara, this blue group under Bahrumshah. The guy in the middle, who was trying to instigate lone wolf attacks through social media, was killed. I think that's been confirmed now in November. So we need to continue to watch Indonesia, but we're still dealing with terrorist groups that are being reasonably well handled by the Indonesian police. So I don't think we should take an apocalyptic view of the level of extremism in Southeast Asia. That said, As I mentioned, regional cooperation is not at the level that it should be. And I think one of the things Marawi exposed was how much ongoing distrust remains between Malaysia and the Philippines. The roots are in the Sabah issue, but it's still something that inhibits information sharing and cooperation. I think there's a lot of concern on the part of Indonesians and Malaysians about sharing sensitive information with counterparts in the Philippines, where they are aware of some of the clan and family ties that bring local security forces into a kind of cooperation with local extremists. I think on the Indonesian side, there's almost a nationalist factor that we don't want to share information that could lead to bad fates for our nationals. It's almost seen as a betrayal of citizenship. So for all of these reasons, we're not seeing the kind of even development of an integrated watch list of extremists that could be shared across borders. So there's a long way to go in terms of building up that capacity. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I commend both presenters for keeping to time. We do have a bit of time before lunch. Okay, before we have the Q&A, maybe just the key pointers. Mina Rasool talked about the drivers of extremism, violent extremism in Mindanao. She talked about the limitations on the military response, and she made a point that force alone will not be enough to deal with the problem in Mindanao. She also highlighted the issue of false narratives and misconceptions, which need to be addressed by the relevant stakeholders. And importantly, one of the key takeaways from her presentation was the need for the Bangsamoro Basic Law to be passed, hopefully by March 2018, and also the need to engage more with Muslim religious leaders in terms of getting them involved in the effort to counter violent extremism, as well as youth and women, getting them into the process as well. In terms of Sydney Jones' presentation, she pointed out very clearly that the Marawi issue was already a regional issue well before 23rd May. She had pointed out that as a result of the fighting, the conditions for ongoing extremism in the country is still there. Salafi jihadism has become more significant as an ideology there, needs to be addressed. But she made an important point that Southeast Asia should not be seen to be about to become the second front of ISIS. As she put it, we're not going to see any tectonic shift of center of gravity or from Syria to here. However, importantly, she made the point that the ISIS ideology is now more broad-based, not just among the poor, but among the more educated classes as well. In terms of the flood, she doesn't expect a flood of returning foreign fighters, but there will be a trickle, and some of these people need to be watched. And in particular, she looked at Indonesia, where the example of Marawi may inspire the extremists there to come together to pose a greater threat to the country and perhaps to the region. So with that, can we have some Q&A? Yes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Asma New Chan from Malaysia. I would like to ask Dr. Amina, do you think that President Duterte offers or provides the best hope ever in the history of the protracted conflict to bring in, to pave the way for the beginning of the end of this conflict? Because he not only comes from the area, coming from the area, he knows like the back of his hand what the conflict is all about. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that question. Gives me a chance to suck up to my president. Most of us really do and still believe that he's the best hope for a resolution of the conflict of the South because he's the first president from Mindanao. He has had experience dealing with the liberation fronts, and the liberation fronts view him as somebody who is fair. Unfortunately for us, the president, his priority, really, when you look at it, would be the drug war and keeping the nation safe. Second is a shift to federalism. And then third, we're talking about Mindanao development. And the Bangsamoro Basic Law and the peace process is part of that. So it now depends on whether we can lobby enough with the president so that the third becomes of equal priority as his focus on keeping his people safe and winning the drug war.
I just add that I don't think that President Duterte ever understood what he was dealing with these radicalized groups, because when the military operations began in Basilan and Holo against the ASG, I think the kidnapping for ransom groups and the extremist pro-ISIS groups were conflated. And there was never an effort to try and understand the need to develop a non-military solution or a non-military set of measures that could accompany the military operations. I don't know.
Well, I have to agree with Dr. Jones on that. Sydney touches that really to the point that we don't really have a comprehensive program to neutralize the sentiment. You have military action, but no prevention program. But with regards to kidnap for ransom and the president's focus on that, that's really the basic problem. He is so focused on his first two priorities that the others, which to us are very key, are delegated. In the case of Marawi, for instance, we know that a very senior government official, military, from the military side, did not propose for the martial law and the bombing. They had proposed something else. But unfortunately, I think the advisors were with the president at the time opted for a very strong military action. And if the president has really not made a very strong position on how to deal with this, then there is room for influence. And this is where we're trying to come in to help convince the president that we should invest more on prevention and de-radicalization instead of opting for a very strong military solution.
Thank you. There's a question over there. Dr. Hussein.
Not here. It's not on.
Yeah, it's
Is it
on.
on? Is it on? Yeah. My name is Hussein Mutallab. I have an observation to make, and it would be nice if both the speakers can enlighten us on this observation. You know, there are so many things about the Muslim plight in the Philippines in general that is known to all of us. One, the Muslim plight is not new, but of a very long standing. Two, the aftermath of Marawi has devastated the city and its population to such an extent that any repair or reconstruction work will take decades and decades to see any fruits thereof. And finally, the record of all Filipino governments, no exception, I think, a personal view, has not been as forthcoming and as positive in terms of resolving the long-standing Muslim plight in the Philippines. So this is the naughty observation from me. Whatever has been said, whatever is being planned, the future of the Muslim plight in Mindanao in general, and the Marawi Muslims in particular, will continue to be very, very bleak indeed. Your comments. Thank you.
Well, I agree with your observations completely. Last month, we had a consultation workshop, a 2-day workshop with Muslim religious leaders, a lot of them from Mindanao, but also from other regions of the country. And when we started talking to them about the aftermath of Marawi, the religious leaders from Marawi told us that during the first week of the siege, to a man, the Marawi residents really were against the Maute gang and their family and blamed them heavily for the siege. But as the siege extended and extended, there has been a very strong shift who to blame. And now the blame resides on the doors of the military for prolonging the thing. So it is even more complicated now, the resolution of the armed conflict in the South. So you're absolutely right about that. Is anything being done about it? Yes, the people who are pursuing the peace process are still at it to make sure that the Bangsamoro Basic Law is passed, because we believe that this is a very strong confidence builder. That if you pass the Bangsamoro Basic Law, then government can say, we are sincere about giving you a just peace as we had agreed on. But unfortunately for us, you know very well what happens, the dynamics in the democratic community, focusing on elections. This could fall by the wayside. So we are still hopeful, but as Dr. Sally mentioned earlier, and I'll borrow it, we are guardedly optimistic about the future.
I think that we have to understand the pull of the ISIS ideology. So in addition to the injustices and the resentment that may drive extremism in the Marawi area in the aftermath of the siege, I think we need to understand that that the ISIS ideology was exerting a very strong pull, not just in Marawi, but among Maguindanans, among Tausug, among these recent Muslim converts, because it promised an idea of the perfect Islamic state. And maybe because what they have in Mindanao is so imperfect, that provided some kind of appeal. But unless we understand that there was a positive pull factor that was drawing people in through religious discussions that were taking place in mosques across Mindanao, then I think we're going to miss the opportunity for preventive action that Dr. Amina was talking about.
Thanks. Before I recognize Malcolm and you, there was a hand. I can't see you. Sorry, can you stand up?
Woman.
Yes, yes. Oh.
I'm sitting at the back, so you didn't see me. I'd like to ask, particularly Sydney, the questions about, you mentioned that the foreign terrorist fighters from Indonesia are unlikely to go to the Philippines, but rather they like to return to Indonesia. So, and how concerned are you about the strengthening pull of ISIS ideology in Indonesia, given the rise of identity politics and so on? That's one question. Secondly, you mentioned about the weakness of regional cooperation. How effective was the Indonesian, Malaysian, Philippines cooperation in preventing the spillover of the Marawi effect? And what more should we need to do this? And maybe, thirdly, you are not concerned about Southeast Asia becoming a second front. We were all rather worried that the Rohingya issue could be another, casus belli for the rise of ISIS ideology here. So maybe just a comment there as well. Thank you.
Thanks. I think one of the interesting things about the pro-ISIS groups in Indonesia is that they came overwhelmingly from existing groups. If you look at this group JAD, its core structure was an earlier group called JAT, Jama' Ansharat Tawheed, but before that, there were groups that had been involved in DENEE, the Dar al-Islam and the Islamic State. So whatever happens to ISIS, and whether or not the ISIS ideology survives, these groups will survive in some other new and virulent form. So I think we need to be concerned about individuals, even a handful, coming back from Syria. But even if that doesn't happen, I think these groups are not going to go away. They're going to exist as the groups in the Philippines will exist, maybe with locally driven ideologies more than universalistic jihadi ideologies. I think that Indonesia in particular played an extremely important role in trying to get a trilateral effort underway in the aftermath of Marawi to bring in Indonesia, the Philippines, and Malaysia into a more cooperative group. But I think one of the things that they realized is that you can talk about, for example, joint military patrols, but it doesn't actually translate into a real working relationship. It's more informing each other when their own ships might be in the region together. Also, it hasn't yet translated into a significant shift in a significant improvement in the nature of information sharing that takes place because of all these factors that I mentioned, political and in some cases bureaucratic. In terms of the Rohingya, I think that is a major problem for the region. I think we're already seeing Indonesian and Malaysians trying to get to Cox's Bazar to make contact with some of the groups in the camps. Now, there's an officially sponsored set of humanitarian actors doing great work going into those camps, sponsored by the foreign ministries in both countries. But there are also groups outside those officially sponsored groups that are going in with more, in some cases, propagation, hardline propagation goals in mind. And if they can get into the camps, then extremists can get into the camps as well. And I think the Rohingya issue is going to be a problem for a long time to come. It's also going to be the issue that brings South Asian and Southeast Asian extremist groups together.
Thanks. Final comment to Amina?
Yeah. Let me just say something about Southeast Asia becoming the next front. What worries us is that Southeast Asia is ripe to be a second front. It's not that we fear that the ISIS soldiers and leaders will move over to the region. They don't need to. The foreign fighters, for instance, who were able to escape Marawi, they can go back to Indonesia and Malaysia. They do not need to go to Marawi because we now have, thanks to the Marawi siege and the way it was played up by media, we now have local recruits that are coming up. So what we worry about is the world having a second arena, and it would be Southeast Asia. What's so worrisome about that? We have Rohingya, we have Southern Thailand, and we have Mindanao. Southern Thailand, for instance, a friend of mine always says that the locals call it Northern Malaya. This is ripe for putting together the makings of a caliphate, of an Islamic state, and that worries us endlessly.
Unfortunately, we have run out of time. We have to go for lunch, but I'm sure you'll agree with me that we had a very rich session. So please join me in thanking our two speakers this morning.
Thank you, Associate Professor Kumar and distinguished speakers.